Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Cultivating Joyous and Educational Just Spaces for All. My name is Amanda Rothengas, the Program Manager for Inspire, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Both Inspire and Harmony host these webinars where thought leaders and educators share best teaching practices and tools to support social emotional learning. These presentations are the opinions and content of our guest speakers and may not necessarily be a direct representation of Harmony or Inspire. For best viewing of this webinar, it's recommended that you shut down your other browsers. Please use the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel to submit questions, comments, or ponderings for our speaker. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a copy of the recording within the next week. If you're watching this webinar live, you'll receive a certificate of completion from GoToWebinar within 48 hours. You can also download a copy of the slide deck today under the Handout tab on your GoToWebinar panel. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker. Ms. Juliana Urtubey is a first-generation bilingual immigrant who loves school. Juliana Urtubey is spending this year advocating for a joyous and just education for all students that celebrates their families, identities, and communities. Juliana, a National Board Certified Teacher, is known as Miss Earth for her efforts to beautify schools and unify the community through murals and gardens. She is a special education co-teacher at Kermit Booker Elementary in Las Vegas, Nevada. Ms. Urtubey is the first Latinx National Teacher of the Year since 2005. Please join me in welcoming the 2021 CCSSO National Teacher of the Year, Juliana Urtubey. Welcome, Juliana.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's wonderful to be here with you all. I am so excited to join teachers across the country, centering what we all agree is one of the most crucial elements of education today, which is improving the social and emotional wellness of our entire community, starting with our students, not forgetting ourselves and our colleagues and our students' families. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to dive in today to talk a little bit about my framework, talk a little bit about how I see the educational world and some of the things that we can do together to improve the situation for everybody. Like Amanda said, I am Juliana Urtubey. I'm a proud National Board Certified Teacher, and I'm exceptionally proud to be our 2021 National Teacher of the Year. It gives me great joy to be able to represent all of the amazing educators out there. I have yet to meet a teacher that hasn't inspired me on this course of being the National Teacher of the Year. And it's a profound honor to be able to represent the people that every day impact the children in our country, which is, I believe, our greatest and brightest hope for a better tomorrow. So we called this presentation Cultivating a Joyous and Just Space because what we want for our students is something that we have to create. What we want for ourselves as educators and professionals is something that we have to create, and we have to do it in collaborations with others. In my culture, collective thinking is very natural and normal to who we are. Thinking about the wellness of everybody in the group, knowing that we are only as strong as other people in our group is really important, and making sure that everybody has a voice is really central. And so I carry these ideals, these values with me into my educational spaces. And I remember one day I was just sitting there and I'm like, how am I going to embrace how I see the educational world? How am I going to embrace the fact that I'm a special education teacher and I serve students with learning and thinking differences? The fact that I'm a bilingual teacher and I love being able to learn and access the world in 2 languages. How am I going to embrace the fact that I believe spaces on school campuses are so elemental to the outcomes of our students on campus? And so I thought, instead of dividing all of these things that I'm really passionate about in education, why not bring them together? And immediately the first phrase that came out of my mouth when I was thinking about that is that it's all in an effort to create joy and justice for students. And so with that idea, I was able to umbrella my framework, my lens, my philosophy, my values as an educator, but also encapsulate my hope for our profession, my hope for the educational experiences that all students have the right to access. So today, I wanted to set some objectives for us. And I understand that these objectives are somewhat abstract, but because I believe that the work of setting our framework, understanding our lens, and the language we use is so important. Those are the ingredients that are often invisible, and that is what translates into the classroom. So today I want to dig deep, pun intended, into the frameworks and lenses that we use. Think about where they come from, think about how they're serving our students, how they serve joy and justice, and maybe if they don't, how to look at them in a way that will help us push so that we are including absolutely every member of our learning communities. I know that language has a huge impact on how students feel in our classroom. I remember as a child always kind of feeling subcategorical, right? Like I imagined what normal looked like, and then a lot of things in my life made me feel like I was abnormal or not normal, subcategorical. And I don't want my students to ever feel that way. So that's why I think it's so important for us to dive deeply into our philosophies of education. So I wanted to reflect on how we do that. How do we assess our learning spaces for inclusion and equity? How do we apply these different lenses in order to not just build relationships, but build healthy relationships that are grounded in social justice, that are grounded in being able to right the wrongs of our history? And then how do we evaluate methods for meeting students exactly where they are in terms of their academics, but also in terms of their social and emotional development? These are the questions that guide me each and every day, and I'm so excited to be able to explore them with you. So today, our agenda, I'm just going to give the slide a second. Oh, Amanda, I'm not sure if you can help me. I'm not able to advance the slide. There we go. Okay, so today our agenda is going to be through a whole lot of storytelling. I want us to start by pondering how stories help us cultivate community. How can we use these stories to help ground ourselves in equity? I'll share with you my story so that you can understand where this idea sprouted from. And then we'll take a deep dive into what I believe encompasses, at least partially, a joyous and just education. I'll tell you the story of how we were able to co-create a beautiful garden and learning space in my school community at Crestwood Elementary. And then I'll tell you what the pillars of social and emotional learning and wellness were through the learning that we did in the garden. I'll end off with a little bit of growth stories from my students, stories that always inspire me to keep moving forward, stories that remind me that we are making an impact as educators. I know sometimes we feel like we're not, but it's going back to these stories, these teacher mementos. I know we all have a drawer of awesome teacher cards that students made for us. Going back to these mementos helps me ground myself. And then also, it's so crucial for us to center around this idea of storytelling. You'll see it throughout the agenda, you'll see it throughout the presentation. And I just wanted to draw out the explicit reasoning for that. And that's because I believe in the power of storytelling. Research tells us that we are more likely to remember facts and information through storytelling versus through just kind of like telling people facts and information. And I believe that it's because of the emotional impact that listening to a story has. And then I also believe it's because of the growth that lies in for the storyteller. This last year, well, let me say these last couple of months, since I was named National Teacher of the Year, I have learned how to tell my story. I have learned how vulnerable that makes you when you tell your story. But I've also learned the power of being able to tell your own story. For me, it was so important to be able to learn how to tell my story in a way that was dignified. that honored my family, honored my colleagues and my students. That, like Olmeca, a known hip hop artist and poet, says, it's disrupting the narrative. It was hard to tell my story in a way that disrupted the narrative, because so many times stories about people of color only let us share our sorrows, our exclusion, our marginalization. And while all those things exist, I wanted to be able to tell the story in a way that humanized me and my family. And so that's why, to me, not just as an educator, storytelling is so important, but in terms of building community. So I encourage you to reflect on the times that you encourage your students to tell their stories. How do you help them disrupt the narrative? How do you help them use their stories to push through to feel more free? After all, social and emotional wellness and learning really center on ourselves being able to be free, being able to be our truest selves. So next up, we would like to ask a poll just to get more of an idea of who is in the room. Okay, and Miss Amanda will take over for a quick second to do that.
Yes, thank you so much. So you should see a poll on your screen right now, and we're asking you what is your position right now, if you are in preschool, pre-K, elementary, middle, high school, administration, or other. And if you're in other, feel free to share in the chat or in the question box where you are working in the education space. We love to hear where you're from today. We have about half the votes in. We'll give you another minute here. All right, let's see. What is your educational space? As you can see, the vast majority are in elementary, which is great. 48% in elementary, 21% middle high school. And we have a large group in other, as well as administration and preschool. And in other, we have some counselors joining us, some school climate and wraparound specialists, some STEM informal educators, some after school program providers. So a great diverse audience. Thank you all for being here today.
Yes, thank you all. I think this last year we've realized just how crucial it is to have absolutely every single member of a school community supported. Okay, so now that I know that where we kind of fall in terms of our educational spaces, I would like to preface with saying that this is something that I believe can be carried to all educational spaces, both formal and informal, preschool to gray, as some people like to call. And so I try to make this as general as possible, but please know that the context of the garden that I'm sharing today was preschool to fifth grade. Okay, so stories of us. I believe stories absolutely 100% are tied to our emotional wellness and being. When we know who we are, when we're confident about who we are, that means all of the layers of us. And when we feel accepted and like we belong, that is when we are going to feel our healthiest. And so why do student stories matter? Why do teacher and family stories matter? Well, first of all, they help us build empathy. They help us build a strong connection to each other, and they help to reflect our own humanity. I think that research not only tells us that we learn more from storytelling, but we learn such crucial skills: listening, wonder, learning how to tell our similarities and build solidarity with those similarities, and just alike learning about our differences and learning to see differences as not different than normal or different than what should be, but just different than myself. When students learn that, then they learn how to be free. And when they learn how to be free is when not only we're going to see their best learning, but they're going to be the best peers to each other. They're going to be great friends to each other and really carry and share what it is to be a responsible member of a community. So I share the quote on the following slide by Dina Simmons. I'm sure you all have heard of her. Her work has been transformational in my outlook as an educator and as somebody who advocates for education. One of the things she says is so incredibly simple, but something that I believe we overlook, which is why it's in the title of my platform this year. She talks about the right children have to love school and love learning. I remember listening to her share a story about how she was afforded the opportunity to travel outside of her neighborhood to go to a boarding school. And in this boarding school, although she felt many instances of racial micro and macroaggressions, she also learned to love learning. It was open-ended, it was rich, it was layered. And then she tells a story about how when she would go back home, the children around her didn't feel the same way about learning. Why did she have the opportunity to love her learning because of the type of school she went to, but her neighborhood friends didn't have that same opportunity? I saw myself very much reflected in that story, and in that story about being able to contextualize this love for learning. Love for learning is a political thing. It's something that we want absolutely all students to have access to, and it's something that we understand that Brown, Black, Indigenous children may not have equitable access to this. And so in schools, we have the opportunity to embrace what maybe society hasn't just yet embraced. What does it look like to have a just system working? Well, we can create that in our classrooms. And I think that along with knowing that every child deserves an education that guarantees safety to learn in their comfort of their own skin means kids don't have to negotiate who they are. They can show up to that school as their full self without having to feel self-conscious about their hair, their clothes, their languages, their accents, any of these things. They can just show up exactly as who they are. And it reminds me also about the need to contextualize how families may have had negative or hurtful experiences in public education. It is quite often family members come to me and tell me, you know, I also really struggled in school with my behavior and I got kicked out of school, or they would share stories about really hard things that happened to them. And so I understand that as a human, bringing your child to a school must create some kind of fear and anxiety that your child might feel the same kind of exclusion that you felt. And so I think that teachers, although we carry a lot, carry the responsibility to communicate to families, this is a safe space. This is a space where your child will learn in peace and have safety to be themselves. So we're going to pause for a quick reflection question. And that quick reflection question is going to ask you to think about your why. What is your why for showing up in these spaces? And then once you've kind of jotted it down, if you're a journaler and you want to write it down, or you want to draw a picture, or maybe you just want to think about it and keep it in your head, once you have established what is your why, I want you to think about what is the origin of your why. Why do you show up to these spaces all the time? And what allows you to show up as yourself? I'll give you about 10-15 seconds to reflect. For me as an educator, I know how hard it is. In fact, right before this webinar, I got off the phone with a dear friend who was crying. She teaches kindergarten, and it was just a hard day. I mean, every day that she's teaching is hard. Kids have a lot of needs right now. This is a group of kindergartners who didn't have a whole lot of schooling support before they started kindergarten. And if we think about the last year and a half, 2 years, and the impact it has had on families, particularly families that have low access to economic comfort, we think about just how much more need our students are coming with. And you know, all we did was just sit there and listen. But one of the things she said really stood out to me. She says, no one's come knocking on my door to see how I am. And so I just want to remind you all to keep checking on each other, and that we're going to get through this together. So grounding ourselves in our why is so crucial, so that we remember the reason that we show up and the conviction. Where does the conviction come from? And that, I think, is so powerful for teachers. And then the origin of our why is kind of a reminder to never forget who we are or where we come from. So I'm going to share my story because I believe profoundly in this concept that when we empower others, nobody loses out. When we empower others and everyone, beautiful things happened. And so my story will hopefully show you where this idea sprouted from and why these frameworks are so important to me. I was born in Bogota, Colombia, and like so many of my students and many of my colleagues, my family had to make the difficult decision to leave our home country due to violence and war. It was during the height of the Civil War that my family decided to leave so that my sisters and I could have a safer upbringing. When it was time for my family to send me to school, I remember the sense of worry that my mother felt when she realized that the school that I would be sent to and my sisters and I would be sent to felt unwelcoming and unknown and perhaps unsafe to her. This is saying a lot from a woman who was able to survive war and really intense political times. And so although my family's immigration story is quite different than so many folks within the Latinx or first generation immigrant community, because my family did have access to documentation and to safe travel, I realized that my story holds a lot of privilege, but at the same time, we know that so many folks don't have that kind of privilege. And so I imagine standing in the footsteps of that school that my mom was supposed to send me to and thinking of what propelled her forward. You know, she made this journey to be able to provide a safe upbringing for my sisters and I. And I can only imagine the emotions she felt when she realized that that wasn't accessible to her. My parents having a lot of privilege in formal education, my mom studying linguistics and she was a lawyer and my dad was a musician. They leveraged those skills to be able to find me and my sister's entrance into a magnet program that was bilingual. It was a multilingual school program that focused on international students. And so we were so lucky to be admitted into that school in exchange for my mom teaching Spanish at the school and my dad doing music classes. I was incredibly lucky as a child. I got to see my family and my parents validated every single day in my education. And while I'm so deeply honored and grateful for their advocacy and for being able to leverage their strengths, I know at my core that all children deserve the right to love learning. All children deserve to be in a school where they feel truly embraced, where they feel like they can be themselves. Those types of schools should be accessible to absolutely all children. It's not something families should have to fight for or advocate for. We understand that not all schools are prepared to receive families in a welcoming manner. And so because of that, we know that it's the school's responsibility to truly assess their spaces, not just for equity, but for those invisible things that make folks feel either welcomed or unwelcomed. So it's with this concept that I was driven to become the kind of educator who saw brilliance and beauty in every single family without exception, who was able to see the strengths within the families that were part of our school. So the way that I mentioned before about being able to embrace my hopes and dreams for education came out as a framework called the Joyous and Just Educational Framework. And really, what this encapsulates is both the beauty of education, the power of transforming together, right? The power of teachers harnessing social and emotional wellness in their classroom for themselves, for their students and their families, but also doing so in a way that we are righting the wrongs of what has happened in our country, what has happened in public education, and being able to meet our students with those needs. And so one of the ways that we start my school year off with my students is to do a scientific lesson. My students think it's science, and it is science, but it's also social and emotional learning. And basically what we do is we display a bunch of seeds, all sorts of seeds, and then my students get to answer the essential question of what is inside of a seed? What helps a seed grow? And really, it's all through their intuition and their observation. They pry open seeds, they plant a bunch of seeds in a bunch of places. They spend a couple weeks really diving in to what's inside of a seed and how does it grow. What we discover through the course of several weeks is that within a seed, there's absolutely everything it needs to be able to sprout. We are always mesmerized when we discover that seeds have a concept of gravity. If you think about that, that's so powerful, right? Seeds within them can sense where to send their roots and where to send their shoots. And then it leads way to being able to translate this learning into social and emotional learning. I ask my students, how are you like the seed? And very often my students will come to the conclusion that within them, they have the strength, the knowledge, the power to be able to sprout. And then we also acknowledge that it's so much about the environment that will determine our likelihood to thrive. The soil composition and the soil health, water access, sunlight, caretakers, human caretakers, all of these things have a huge role in our ability to thrive. And so that is a metaphor that I not only use with my students to harness the power of what we have within and what we have as a community, but also to set the framework for a joyous and just education. There we go. Okay, joy. You know, sometimes people ask me, how are you so happy? Things are really hard. How do you maintain happiness? And I'm not sure if it's happiness. One of the things that I've learned is that there's a distinct difference between happiness and joyfulness. Joyfulness is tied to our hope. I always have a hope for a better tomorrow. And for me, joy is really grounded in this concept of belonging. Right? When we know who we are and we know our role within a collective community, that sense of belonging is profound because it gives us a role. When we adhere to the value that all work is important, all people have equal value, then people can really experience that joy that comes deep from within and radiates outward. And so we know students are happiest when they can be their truest selves. And so the way we do that is by always knowing who our students are, including their culture, their languages, their families, their communities, their histories, their identities. And we use all of those things so students can see themselves within a community. And what we realize is when we do that, and when we center that, community thrives. And I was reviewing Castle's competencies, and I think that they're so helpful in terms of grounding. How do we experience joy? How do we measure if our students are experiencing joy that is profound? And I think that these competencies are really part of what it is that we're trying to do. So when students are self-aware, they know who they are. A huge part of self-awareness is knowing your strengths. Everybody has strengths. I work with children with learning and thinking differences who have exceptionalities. And sometimes they've gone through years and years of schooling feeling unsuccessful. And so what I do is I really have them question, what does it mean to be successful? Who measures your success? And how do you want to inform that success? Right? And so in putting our children in the driver's seat of that, then we kind of break these expectations of who they should be and allow them to be themselves. The only way we can do that is if teachers know who our students are so we can guide them through their process of self-awareness and self-management. Later, I'll tell you a little bit, a story or two about this with some students. Social awareness. I think social awareness is so important, particularly for our students who are new to the country, who are linguistically gifted like me. I say linguistically gifted to anybody who speaks another language in addition or instead of English. we need to be able to make these social awareness skills something that is very explicit. These skills, again, are really tough because sometimes they're not taught explicitly, and sometimes they go against and they rub against our cultural identities. So how can we ensure that the social awareness that we're guiding our students through really aligns with who they are culturally, really aligns with who they are in terms of the developmental level? And I find that being able to propel this with a kindness soaked in social justice is really important. The next part is, how do our students connect to other students and to other adults? There's a saying that my mother says all the time, and it loosely translates to every single child deserves an adult who is absolutely crazy about them, who just loves them to no end. I want to be that person for all of my students, but understand that sometimes I can't be, right? Sometimes students have other preferences. And so it's my role as their teacher to make sure that all of my students are mentored by someone if that person can't be me. And it's also really important for me to help my students harness powerful relationships with other students. Students that look like them, students that don't, students that think like them, students that don't, students their age, students who are younger and older. It's through these relationship skills that our students claim their identities at school. And so it's so crucial to be able to support our students through that. And the last is responsible decision making. I believe the majority of decisions that happen for schools, about schools, should be made with absolutely everybody in school. So that joy comes from having that voice being a key key part of the ecosystem of our schools, students, families, community voice in that decision making. And as we model that decision making, our students will really come to life. Now, the justice part is really important. And everybody's going to handle this a little bit differently based on their context, based on the happenings in your school, in your district, in your area. Nonetheless, a just education acknowledges that there are barriers that we have to dismantle in terms of our students having access to equitable education, equitable disciplinary practices, meaning practices that help our students learn and reflect from their behavior and improve their behavior so that they can be more of themselves and a better teammate to others. And we understand that this is a calling of our time. And so while we do this, I have had a lot of time to think about how justice really hinges on us understanding our power dynamics. When teachers and educators understand the amount of power that they have, it's so incredibly important for us to be able to know that that power is a careful responsibility, that we need feedback and we need reflection on constantly to ensure that we are giving space for others within those power dynamics. With that was born this concept that I've been thinking and developing, is the difference between collaboration and compliance. When our students help us co-create and collaborate our educational spaces, then they're not adhering to the norms and the procedures because they have to, but instead because they speak to them. A quick example that I like to give is that during the beginning of the school year, I don't tell my students they have to walk in a quiet straight line. Instead, we spend some time researching ducks, and we watch videos of ducks, mama ducks and baby ducks, and we read books about ducks. And then I ask them, why do you think they might walk in a line? And our students will come up with things like to keep everybody safe. If someone gets lost, then we know right away, to make sure we get wherever we're going fast because there might be a fox coming to eat them. That's a true story. That was a true response, and I'll never forget that. Nonetheless, my students come to the conclusion that it's the best thing for their group to be able to walk in a line so that they can keep each other safe. I mean, talk about community care. I've spoken about how it's so important for people to have a voice. And I think that at this point, I want to clearly distinguish the fact of having a voice and having good relationships with having a healthy voice and a healthy relationship. I think healthy voices and relationships form when we are maybe not able to right all the wrongs, but when we are walking with our students on this path to justice, Sharif El-Mekki, the director of the Black Male Educator Pipeline in Philadelphia, talks to us about how justice is really the goal. At the end of this long road, what do we want for absolutely everybody? Well, we want a just world where everybody can exist and everybody has access to what they need. And so with all of this, I think it's so crucial for us to constantly be looking at our spaces. Are we assessing for inclusion? When we look at who participates, who's participating more? Who maybe doesn't feel like they have a voice in a space to participate? And this can be done in really micro lenses like our classroom. This can be done at more macro, like our entire school or district or even state. And these are commitments that we make with our students to say, hey, maybe these things aren't fair, but I have a feeling that together we can, one, start to understand them, and two, start to design ways where in school we're doing something different. And then three, hey, you as children and me as your teacher, together we have the power to voice our concerns. So let's go ahead and do it together. Okay, so next up, I have a reflection question. And what we're going to do is Amanda, our moderator, is going to read some of the comments once you've had some time to share. I want to know, because I believe joy and justice exist in so many educational spaces across the country, I want to know, what are some examples in your spaces that are examples of children not just experiencing, but living joy and justice in their class?
So go ahead and type your answers in the question box, and we'll share out a few responses as they come in. Thank you so much, Juliana. The comments so far coming in, everyone's so inspired by your words. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot of great thoughts on other examples of joy and justice, but thank you for the examples that you've already shared.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you. I think sometimes when we think about changing education, we feel a huge weight, a huge responsibility. And I'm always guided by the saying, think global, act local. When we understand the world and we understand why some things may be unfair or unjust, but we can think about our reach. My classroom is always my reach. And sure, there are things that are being imposed on us as teachers that we don't want to do or we believe aren't best for our children. We have to do them sometimes anyway. But what are the things in my classroom that I can control? What are the things that I can design in a way that's going to truly bring out the humanity in my students? You know, when you think about hearing people talk about the teachers that influence them, often we hear about teachers who believed in students, teachers who listened to students, teachers who gave students a safe space. And so I think that in the time that we feel so heavy about education, that those are the things that can guide us and propel us forward.
Great. We're getting some wonderful responses. Family pictures in the classroom, calling students by their preferred names. We have a garden for the whole community. Greetings in the morning upon arrival. Smiling faces, restorative circles, diversity and examples in different activities. Asking students how they identify, example, male, female, non-binary, etc., and using their preferred pronouns. Creating a safe environment.
Wonderful, yes. Those are wonderful examples. Those are examples how maybe out there in the world, you're not being valued as a human, but in my classroom, you will be. Thank you so much. Okay, so I told you before, and I kind of alluded to it, we co-constructed a garden in my school. It took us 6 years, and the process to build it was absolutely slow. But the reason it was slow was, one, because we wanted to make sure that we could sustain whatever we were building, and two, we wanted to make sure that students and families had absolute voice in what it was that we were creating. So I firmly believe that your space will dictate behavior. And so if you have a space that is warm and encouraging, open-ended and affirming, then that's the kind of results that you will receive with your students. At my school, it was a garden. But at your school, this can look very different. This can be a cozy reading area. This can be a basketball group or a robotics class. This can have any shape or form that it needs to have in your community to be able to meet the needs of your students and their families. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a few things that I believe are really important in building this garden. It ended up being a garden that took over 15,000 square feet of unused grass and dirt area in our school. It was a garden that absolutely communicated to our community, this is a welcoming place for you and your family, and we're so happy that you're here. And we had community participate in hundreds of different ways because we knew that everybody's contribution to the garden was equally valuable. Sometimes if families couldn't join us on our community build days, they would send cut fruit or lemonade. Sometimes families would go and buy us decorative flowers to plant around the garden beds and just deliver them. Sometimes families would come, but only come for a little bit and come with their young children, and the young children would play. And that was all beautiful. So we accepted and encouraged all kinds of participation. We not only encouraged the teachers to participate, but our students and their families and our staff. We even had a neighbor who lived across the street from the school who attended the school way back when our school was built in the 50s. She came over and she brought her lawn chair and she posted up and she just shared stories the whole time. There was no wrong way to participate. We also made sure to have a common identity and also encourage our students' identities to shine. We were known as the Gnomies, which is the word gnomes and homies, like friend, mushed together. We were the Gnomies, and we really wanted absolutely everybody to shine. To this day, students who just graduated high school but were in the garden club and the garden program still call themselves Gnomies, and it's quite cute when I bump into them around the neighborhood. Next is family and community. I wanted this to be a place for intergenerational healing. I wanted the family members to come and know that the pain and weight of not feeling accepted because maybe they didn't speak a common language or maybe they didn't have formal education themselves, that they felt that weight when they came to the school. I wanted that weight to be lifted. And so we made sure that we had lots of moments of joy. Family members had all the voice in what we did in the garden. The mothers planted a medicinal herbs area where they would use everything from artichoke leaves to chamomile and take those herbs home and be able to provide healing for themselves and for the community. The important thing was that we all had a common goal, and that was our students. The next is inclusion. As a special education teacher, this is absolutely the most important thing for me. And I learned that particularly in spaces like spaces of public education, just like we do in our lesson plannings, how we plan backwards from the goal and from the objective and how our students are going to get there, that's how we have to plan for our school spaces. So we have to look and understand historically the marginalization and exclusionary practices and said, okay, who is most likely to feel excluded from this building? Let's make sure that we're planning for them first. And so an example could be making sure that we had sensory options for our students who had autism or who are neurologically diverse. Another option was making sure we had childcare for the families who did want to get in there and dig with the shovel, but they had young children. So we made sure that we established a safe area for them to come with their children so that they didn't have to worry about childcare. We also made sure that all of our signs were bilingual, that we encouraged our native speaking in the garden, that work schedules were honored. And so we made sure to switch up the times of when we were doing activities in the garden so that families could participate, even if it was just once a quarter, but they could participate because we took the time to say, hey, what are the best times for you to come where you don't have to worry about taking off from work or you don't have to worry about transportation? What are the best times? And we would use that data to be able to create times and spaces. We also made sure that we had plenty of food to share with our community, time to enjoy that food. And so all of these details may seem minute on their own, but when we put them together, we have more of holistic inclusion. And I think that a huge part of that is being able to understand the historical context of our students. We have to know when groups that they are a part of have felt marginalization, exclusion, and we have to right those wrongs in the garden, right? So where many families may have felt like they didn't belong in a school because they didn't speak English, we turned that around and said, oh my goodness, we're so happy that you speak Tagalog or Spanish. We need more help. We need this and this and this. And we saw value in in that participation. And that value was genuine, and it continues to be genuine, because I'll say this time and time again, my best students are students and their families, without a doubt. And so we're really doing the favor for ourselves, because when we holistically include everybody, that's when we get the best lessons for everyone. Okay, another reflection. I've spoken about healthy relationships. As teachers, we talk about relationships all the time, but I want to add on that we have to have healthy relationships. This means that although there's always love in the relationships, that love is hinged on this commitment to be able to right some of those wrongs, right? And so for some teachers, that means looking at biases and doing that personal internal growth. But for you, what is the connection between joy and justice and healthy relationship building with our students, their families, and their communities?
Yes, go ahead and answer in the question box. And we have some responses coming in from last time that also correlate to this response. Giving the students the opportunity to assist with creating the classroom space and the norms and expectations for their learning environment. Each classroom has a calming corner. As a guidance counselor, I can see students beginning to see all of their feelings are valid. By offering a safe and supportive environment for students, including positive affirmations as a reminder to students. And there's some more coming in here with your new question. Let's give everyone a minute to ponder this. It's a deep question. Someone shared about the affirmation mirror. Compassion, common humanity, loving kindness for one another. Necessary for everyone to feel accepted. If our students and their families cannot trust their educators, educators are not able to assist on the road to joy and justice. Great responses.
I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, and one of the things I learned later in my career was not to be afraid of feedback from students and families. In fact, I started doing it so often that it just became kind of second nature to me and to my students. I would ask them, how did that lesson make you feel? How did that garden activity make you feel? And constantly asking and just making sure that I was on the right path of being able to do that. All right, let's see if I can advance this slide. Thank you. Okay, here we go. So I want to give you some practical tips from the perspective of a special educator of my classroom. So I taught resource, which meant that my students had their classroom and they would come to me for supports, or I would go to them for supports, or a combination of the both. My classroom was hinged on a growth mindset. The theme was always garden, and I love to watch you grow. As you can see in my background, be the best you can be. That's from my classroom. And the students learn to see their strengths. We learn the power of yet, and we learned that we were going to do this in collaboration with their families and with each other. And so I told them that they were already the best learners, because everybody's born with intuition and observation, and that our lens is so unique. And so how lucky were the rest of us to get to have that student share their intuition and observation. This picture that you can see here is my students writing about the life cycle of a monarch. We have a monarch way station at the school, and our students would care for the caterpillars from the time they were eggs to caterpillar to chrysalis to butterfly. I'd like to point out that these 5 students, when I started the school year with them, were unable to write a paragraph. Some of them were working on writing a 2 or 3 word sentence. And I want to show you the power of collective learning. These students worked very hard on that very long paragraph essay that you see about the life cycle of the monarch butterfly and the importance of caring for them for about 2 weeks. And a lot of that time was spent on students supporting each other and making sure that their peers were feeling that success, or feeling like they were learning. So I'd like to share 3 quick stories with you about students who taught me quite a bit about what it means to have joy and justice in the classroom. The first is this concept of linguistically gifted. I would like you to meet Nessa. That's her real name, and the students' stories that I'm about to share with you are my students' pictures, and and their real names in talking to their families, and the families were so proud of their growth that they asked me and encouraged me not only to keep telling their stories, but to do so with their real names. And so when I met Vanessa Nessa, she was really shy, made very little eye contact, was really hesitant to participate. And as I took an interest in getting to know her as a person, I found out that she spoke 4 languages. Her first language is American Sign Language. Both of her parents are deaf. She also learned English in school. And one grandma speaks Tagalog, she's from the Philippines, and the other grandma speaks Spanish, she's from Mexico. And so Nessa is quadrilingual. She speaks 4 languages. And to think that the school had categorized her as an emerging English language learner broke my heart a little bit, because it failed to realize her possibilities. And so Nessa has inspired me to start calling ourselves linguistically gifted. And that extends to the families who speak other languages, because it is so powerful when we tell them that they're powerful because of their languages. And it reminds me the power of truly knowing our students and their families. And this is an ongoing thing. Families change, things shift. It's so crucial to be able to constantly keep that relationship going by understanding who they are. The next story I want to tell you is about my student Leela. And Leela taught me the power of discourse through connection. Leela is neurologically diverse, she's autistic, and she's absolutely beautiful. She has a strong interest in anime and emojis. And so in her drawings or in her math work, she would draw me sometimes not the most appropriate emojis to tell me, not for me, I'm not trying this. So I realized that the way to teach Leela was through discourse, was by building structures that allowed her to understand who she was and how she wanted to communicate her ideas. And so we used a lot of multi-sensory things. We used a lot of pictures and a lot of comics and a lot of anime and a lot of emojis. We used the common hobbies that she would do with her mom, which was growing plants and making knickknacks and crafts that they would sell at different events. We used all of that to be able to harness her ability to have discourse about learning. And it was through her discourse about learning that she felt connected to other people. And she learned the power of using her voice, the power of saying, I'm not comfortable with that, or, ooh, I need some time, or, ooh, I prefer things this way. And once she was able to do this, she was able to engage in really complicated math discourse, which before she was unwilling and uninterested in doing. And again, it reminded me of the power of knowing our students. The next student is Joseph, and he likes to call himself Mr. Comic Squad. So I spent a lot of the time that I learned with him calling him Mr. Comic Squad. And we used his biggest interest, which was drawing comics, as a way to tackle his emotional regulation. Throughout our 3 years together, he created hundreds of comics to help him process learning regulation knowledge. I got to learn from him about what works for students. What does it mean for them to have a voice? And sometimes if they're not ready to do that orally, how can we give them the space to do it? And I also gave me the opportunity to return to Joseph's story. And so here's an example of a comic. We made a superhero comic book about Joseph's superhero powers at school. And we would pose a problem, a challenge, and he would think through it as a comic. And I'll read it to you, but I want you to think about how he sees himself as I read this. So you're taking a test that's really challenging. You do not know the answer to the question. What do? Maybe I should reread. What's the question talking about? And on the paper it says, what is 9 times 10? I should match the equation. Oh, so 9 times 10 equals 90. I solved my problem. And if we go to the next slide, you'll be able to see the difference between the two faces. The face of a student who has a problem and maybe not the self-awareness to address it, but through the power of reflection, you see a student who was able to self-realize and was able to come to a conclusion that not only he felt confident in, but helped him feel like himself through it. The next I'm going to show you is a quick video of a book he made for me. This book he made for me was really, truly beautiful because He made it for me when his team and I had decided that it was crucial for him to be in inclusion only. And so he was going to be exited out of the resource program. And that's our goal as special education teachers, is for our students not to need us anymore. But he made me this book before we left.
My experience at Miss Urtubey's, written by Joseph. Ever since 3rd grade, I went to Miss Urtubey's classroom for body control and for fun. We've learned about how to regulate my emotions. We've also learned about how to calm my body. In 3rd grade, I got sent to Miss Urtubey. She taught me to be a good friend. She makes learning fun, and she even helped me control my body. There's always next time. In 4th grade, I went to Miss Urtubey's again. This time, I went there with other people. Also, it was more advanced with the work. Even though we had some highs and lows, there's no denying that Miss Urtubey is the best teacher around. 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. It's a very sad day for me to leave Miss Urtubey's class. But she's going to come to my class once a week, always going to be with me, and so I'm celebrating for not going to Miss Urtubey's class.
Thank you all for watching that video. You know, when I first saw how he saw me, the time that he said that we had lows, it was when he laid down in a high traffic area, and I was like, Joseph, be careful. And I think the way he saw me was he saw my concern for his well-being. But this book is one of my biggest mementos because it reminds me of the power of transformation for students. So as I wrap up, I'd like to remind you all about this idea of the stories of us and being able to show up as our truest selves. Sometimes the strategies to assess our learning for inclusion and equity come from talking to our students, come from humbling and acknowledging that we have more to learn about our students. It comes from being very critical and very intentional about the lenses and frameworks we use to develop relationships with our students and their families so that we can ensure that those relationships are healthy. And it comes from this constant reflection that will allow us to evaluate our methods for seeing if we are meeting students where they are, if we're starting off from the beauty and the strengths that they have, no matter how many challenges they may present, and if we're building from them. I told you the story of my why. My why is that I believe every child deserves an equitable space that is warm and welcoming and full of possibilities of joy and justice. And I share with you, to close, a comment that my mom sent to me when she came to visit the garden once it was completely built. She said, ¿Cómo si es posible cambiar? El mundo sí puede cambiar y todos podemos ayudar a cambiarlo. Look how it is possible to change. The world can change and we can help it change. Thank you all so much for trusting me, for going through this journey with me. Remember that the work you do has impact. We may not see it today or tomorrow, but we will see it eventually. That QR code has a link to my email and my social medias if you would like to stay connected. Again, I'm so honored to have been with you today.
Wow, Juliana, we are so inspired, and we're hearing in the question box just the thank yous and how beautiful that presentation was and how you inspired us all today and filled our cup. So thank you so much. We don't have a lot of time for questions and answers today, but you have her contact information, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Follow her on social media. She's traveling across the country. We're so honored you made time for us to be here today with your busy schedule. Do you have any closing words for our audience or for our teachers today?
Again, keep doing what you're doing. It makes such an impact. And remember to check on each other. Things are really tough right now. And I have all the belief and hope that you are doing what you need to do. And what you do is enough. And your social and emotional wellness is just as important as your students. So thank you. Thank you for going through this journey together.
Thank you so much. Before we close the webinar, we just want to let you know about our next webinar. Will also be very inspirational on October 21st. We will have Emotions Matter for All Learners, SEL for Traditionally Underserved Students and Educators with Dr. Chris Cipriani, from the director of the Yale Child Study Center. So you don't want to miss that one either, and you can register on our website. Once this webinar comes to a close, a survey will launch on your screen. It's very short, but we greatly appreciate your feedback. We're hearing your feedback in the question box about this inspiring presentation, but we love to hear it in your survey as well. We do read your survey feedback and we take the responses seriously. To this day, our responses have helped us build more successful webinars. We also encourage you to connect with us on social media, share about your feedback of this Inspire webinar today. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Twitter as well. So again, thank you all for joining. We can't wait to see you next month in our October webinar. Until then, stay safe, everyone. Take care.